Montana Territory, October 1884. The first snow came early that year, dusting the dry grass of the Bitterroot Valley like powdered bone. Olivia Mae Morton stood on the porch of the cabin her husband had built with his own 2 hands, arms crossed tight around her shawl, staring out at the empty woodshed. The wind bit through her dress, but it was not the cold that made her chest tighten. It was the fact that winter had come and she was alone. She had buried Thomas 2 springs ago. A fever had taken him fast, left her with nothing but a name carved into a pinewood cross and the sound of her own breath in a house that used to carry a man's laughter. They had no children, just the land and a few stubborn hens that still scratched around the yard. The last of the firewood was gone. She had burned the last log 2 nights before, and the air inside had turned sharp, unkind. She had tried, truly tried, to split more herself. But the old axe head flew off the handle on her first swing. She had not the strength nor the knowledge for felling trees. And she knew what came next if she did nothing. The earth would freeze. The cabin walls would lose their fight against the wind. And she would not live to see spring. The sound of hoofbeats snapped her out of the spiral. She looked up, heart stuttering. A horse and rider crested the rise from the south trail. She recognized the horse, first a roan gelding with a torn ear. Then the man riding him. Orin Pearce. He worked the neighboring ranch 6 miles east, helped the McCullochs run cattle and mend fence. She had seen him once or twice at the post office in town, maybe 3 years back. He had spoken with Thomas then, polite but quiet. These past months she had only glimpsed him from a distance, riding fence line or hauling hay. Now he was coming straight toward her. Orin dismounted before the porch, his boots crunching in the thin snow. He had a long frame, all lean muscle and weather-worn hands. His coat was dusted with frost and a hat shadowed his sharp jaw and brown eyes. In his arms he carried a bundled tarp that clinked lightly with every step. "Mrs. Morton," he said, voice low and steady. "Heard from town you were short on firewood." She blinked. Yes. I am." Without another word, he stepped past her and unloaded the bundle beside the cabin. Inside the tarp were split logs, dry and seasoned, and kindling wrapped in burlap. "I can drop more tomorrow. Got a wagon full. Figured you might need it sooner than later." Olivia swallowed hard. "You came all this way just to bring me wood?" He nodded once. "Winter's not waiting for anyone. I do not know how to thank you." "You do not have to," he said simply. She watched him turn back toward his horse, the wind lifting the edge of his coat. Something in her shifted, a small warmth rising in her chest despite the cold. She stepped off the porch before she could think better of it. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, voice too loud in the hush of morning. He paused, his hand on the reins. "I would not say no." Inside, the fire she had coaxed back to life with anew would crackle gently, casting a soft glow across the cabin walls. Orin sat at the table, his hat tucked respectfully by his boots, his long hands wrapped around the mug she handed him. "I never expected help," she said after a quiet moment. "Not out here." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I do not think we are meant to survive this place alone." Silence fell again, but it was not empty. It was full of something unspoken, something new. She studied the shape of his face in the firelight, the faint scar along his cheekbone, the way his eyes softened when they met hers. "You lost someone?" she asked gently. He nodded once. "My brother. 2 winters ago. Avalanche took the north slope. He was riding through." "I am sorry. I know you lost your husband." She nodded, her throat tight. "Feels like the world keeps going without asking if you are ready." He looked down at his mug. "It does." The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, the warmth held. She poured him another cup and he stayed until the shadows grew long. When he finally stood to go, he looked at her in a way that lingered. "I will be back tomorrow," he said, voice quiet. "I will be here," she replied, her hand brushing the doorframe as he passed. As he rode off into the early dusk, Olivia watched him until he was nothing but a shape against the dark trees. Her fingers still tingled from the heat of the mug, and beneath her ribs, something stirred. She had not felt that in years. The next morning, he returned with another armload of wood and a quiet smile. Then the next and the next. He helped mend the chicken coop, shoveled snow from the roof, and patched a draft in the east wall. He never asked for anything in return. But he stayed longer each day. They talked more. About his years working cattle in Wyoming, her childhood in Missouri, the way winter sounded different in the mountains. He laughed once, really laughed, and she found herself laughing too. They shared bread and stew, stories and silence. And one night, a week after that first delivery, she opened the door to find him already walking up the steps, snow caught in his hair. "You keep showing up," she said, smiling. He met her eyes, something sure and steady in his expression. "I plan to." She stepped aside, heart-thudding. "Then come in." That night, as the fire cracked and the storm raged outside, Orin took her hand in his. No words. Just the touch of warm skin against hers, and the feeling that she was not alone anymore. Not this winter. Not again. Olivia opened the cellar door with both hands braced against the wind, her shawl trailing behind her like the tail of a wounded bird. The storm had passed in the night, but its wake left drifts knee-high and a silence so wide it pressed against the ribs. She stepped carefully down into the dark, the lantern in her grip casting slow, golden arcs across the root vegetables and glass jars shelved in neat rows. She hadn't touched the preserves since the funeral. That spring, she couldn't bear the thought of opening jars Thomas had sealed. But this morning, she felt different, still sad. Always sad, but less like grief was something spilling over, and more like something she could carry. She set the lantern down and reached for the jar of stewed apples, her breath fogging in the cold. Upstairs, her cabin was warmer than it had been in weeks. Orin's firewood burned clean, and the chimney no longer smoked thanks to the new damper he had carved and fit 2 days prior. She didn't hear his horse until she was already halfway back up the steps. When she opened the door, he was brushing snow from his shoulders, his coat stiff with frost at the seams. He held a wrapped bundle under one arm. "I brought something," he said without waiting for her to speak. She stepped aside, her fingers brushing the doorframe. "You always do." He set the parcel on the table and undid the oilcloth. Inside was a sliver of bacon, 2 onions, and a small bag of cornmeal tied with twine. "There's a trapper up north who sells off the extra," he offered. "McCulloch's trade beef for it." She traced the edge of the cloth with her fingertips. "That's kind of you." He shrugged once, then turned his hat in his hands. "Cabin's holding all right?" "It is." She paused. "I found a draft along the floorboards near the bed. Been stuffing it with rags. I can fix that." They stood in the hush, the kind only comes after snow. She motioned to the kettle. "Coffee's still hot." While it steeped, he crouched by the hearth adjusting the logs with the fire iron. His movements were measured, like he was used to quiet company. She watched the way he leaned into the task, how his jaw tightened when he concentrated. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. He glanced back. "Miss what?" "Your old life. Before all this." He sat back on his heels. "I try not to think about it." "But you do." He nodded once, slow. "I was 16 when we came west. My father thought we'd find better land, more sky. What we found was hail that killed the crops and a winter that took my mother." She leaned against the counter. "I didn't know. I don't tell many." She poured 2 cups and handed him one, her fingers brushing his again. He didn't pull away. "Is that why you stayed on with the McCullochs?" she asked. "To make something steadier?" "Partly." He sipped, then looked into the fire. "Mostly, I didn't know where else to go." She nodded, understanding blooming between them like warmth from the stove. "I used to think I'd leave this valley someday. After Thomas passed, I couldn't imagine staying. But I didn't know how to leave either. You don't have to leave to start something new." She sat across from him, the steam between them curling upward like breath in the cold. "What does starting new look like to you?" He met her gaze. "It looks something like this." The words hung there, not rushed, not forced. They just belonged. Later, he pried up the floorboard near the back wall and stuffed the space with horsehair and tallow-soaked wool. She stood nearby, handing him nails as he needed them. "You're quick at this," she said. "I've patched worse for less." She smiled, just a little. "You always talk like you've lived 3 lives already." He hammered the last nail and stood, brushing his hands. "Feels like I have." The wind had died down by the time he stepped outside. She followed him to the porch, her boots creaking softly on the planks. "You could stay for supper," she said, not looking at him. "I've got apples warming on the stove." He looked at her, and for the first time his voice had no guard. "I'd like that." She nodded, then turned back toward the door, her hand resting against the frame. He stepped inside without asking again. That night, as the cabin filled with the smell of stewed apples and frying bacon, Olivia set 2 plates at the table. She didn't think about the chair that had sat empty for too long. It wasn't empty now. She sat across from Orin, their hands close, not touching but close. And for the first time in many months, she felt the shape of something whole returning to her life. Not the same shape it had once been, but something strong, something real. Orin looked at her across the table, his face softened by the firelight. "You're not hard to be near, Olivia." She didn't answer. She just reached for the spoon and served him first. The snow held through November, crusting the eaves in thick ridges and turning the creek into a slow-moving ribbon of ice. By then, Orin had begun staying through dusk most evenings, sometimes leaving only after the stars came out, the sky blank as a slate above the valley. He never asked for more than a place by the fire and something warm in his hands, and Olivia never offered what she wasn't ready to give. But the distance between them had softened like frost melting off the bark when the sun finally touched it. That afternoon, she stood on the ladder he'd built and nailed together himself, balanced high against the cabin wall. Her gloves were too worn for this kind of work, but she needed to clear the chimney cap of soot and snow. Orin had meant to do it the day before, but one of the McCulloch yearlings had thrown a shoe and he'd ridden out to help them. She had just reached the top rung when the ladder shifted beneath her. The wind caught her skirt and her boots slipped. For a breath, all she could see was sky. A strong hand caught her elbow and steadied her. "You shouldn't be up here alone," Orin said, voice low but firm. She exhaled hard, knees trembling as he helped her down, one cautious step at a time. "I didn't expect you till evening," she said when her feet touched earth again. "Came early. Figured you might try something like this." She opened her mouth to argue but thought better of it. "Well, you figured right." He glanced up at the chimney. "I'll take care of it." As he climbed, she paced slow circles in the snow below, watching the way he moved, sure but not careless, like someone who'd spent a lifetime reading the moods of half-broken horses and brittle fence posts. When he climbed down, he brushed his gloves clean and looked at her. "Draw's clear now. You'll get a cleaner burn come nightfall. You always know what needs doing," she said. "I pay attention." They didn't go inside right away. The sky was pale and wide, and the quiet between them wasn't heavy. She pulled her shawl tighter and leaned against the porch rail. "You always this careful with folks?" she asked. He thought a moment. "Only when I want them to be all right." She looked at him, then really looked at the way his coat had worn thin at the elbows, the faint line across his neck where sun and time had marked him. There was a steadiness to him that made her feel less like she was surviving and more like she was living again. "I used to feel like I was held together by habit," she said. "Wake up, feed the hens, patch the roof, sleep. Repeat. But lately, it feels different." His gaze didn't waver. "What's changed?" "I think I forgot what it felt like to be seen. Not pitted. Not gossiped about. Just seen." "I see you, Olivia." The wind stirred the bare branches overhead. She looked down at her boots, then back at him. "You never ask for anything." "I've wanted to," he said. "Plenty of times." "Why haven't you?" "Because I didn't want to take before you were ready to give." She stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of ash still clinging near his collar. "What if I am ready now?" He didn't answer right away. He just reached out and touched her wrist, rough fingers light against the wool of her sleeve. "I'd stay tonight if you asked me to." The last of the afternoon light spilled gold across the yard, catching in the snowdrifts and the curls of smoke rising from the chimney. "I want you to," she said. That evening, she lit the lantern early and set an extra place at the table without comment. Orin removed his coat and hung it on the hook by the door, like it belonged there. They ate quietly fried potatoes from the cellar, a bit of sausage he'd brought from the McCullochs, and the last of the pickled beans. Afterward, he helped her wash the dishes, sleeves rolled to his forearms, quiet as always. Her fingers brushed his when she passed him the last plate. She didn't pull away. The fire burned low. She brought out the quilt she'd folded at the foot of her bed, thick with stitched stars, and spread it across the hearth rug. He sat beside her, knees drawn up, hands resting loose over them. "I thought I'd never feel anything again," she said softly. "Not like this." "I know." She looked at him and he didn't look away. "You said you've wanted to ask. What would you have asked?" He turned toward her fully. "If you'd want more than just firewood and quiet company." Her heart beat slow and full. "What if I do? Then I'd stay. For good." She nodded once. "Then stay, Orin." They said nothing else that night. He laid his palm over hers, and she leaned into his shoulder, the fire dipping low behind the grate. The cabin didn't feel so hollow anymore. Somewhere beyond the woods, an owl called once and fell silent. Inside, the quiet was warm, and filled with something steady and just beginning. By early December, the snow no longer came in flurries but in long, heavy silences that blanketed the valley for days at a time. The world outside Olivia's window had narrowed to white fields, bare branches, and the slow, deliberate rhythm of life pared down to essentials. Within the cabin, the air was warmer now, the hearth always lit, the days marked by small, steady acts that wove comfort through the hours. Orin had hung his coat on the same peg every evening for nearly a fortnight. His bedroll stayed tucked beneath the bench by the wall, though he hadn't unrolled it once since the night she'd asked him to stay. Still, he hadn't moved his belongings in, not fully. A man like him didn't assume permanence. He waited to be asked. That morning, Olivia stood at the table folding a strip of muslin for a poultice. One of the hens had limped in from the coop with a twisted claw, and she'd boiled comfrey root and pine resin to draw out the swelling. Orin knelt nearby, holding the bird steady, his hand gentle beneath its wings. "You've done that before," she said. "Once had to splint a dog's leg with a river reed and twine. This is easier. Hen's not fighting me." She dabbed the salve thick along the claw. "You always carry stories like that around and wait for the right moment to let one go?" "Not always. Depends who's listening." She tied the muslin, careful not to pull too tight, and set the bird back in the straw-lined box. Orin stood, brushing feathers from his trousers. "You've a way with pain," he said. "I've had practice." He didn't press further. Instead, he stepped to the window, watching the sky shift from gray to ash-colored blue. A hawk circled low over the ridge, wings quiet as breath. "I've been thinking," he said, voice softer than usual. "When spring comes, McCullochs'll turn their herd south. They'll offer me a trail contract again." Her fingers paused at the edge of the basin. "Do you want it?" "I used to. Good pay, open country." But now he turned toward her. "I don't know anymore." She dried her hands slowly. "You don't have to decide yet." "No, but I'd like to know if staying here is more than just riding out the winter." She met his gaze across the narrow space, her heart steady beneath her ribs. "It is for me." He nodded once, like he'd been holding his breath and could finally let it out. They spent the rest of the morning mending a draft beneath the pantry shelves. She held the lantern while Orin hammered a thin length of board over the gap. The wind outside had quieted, but the cold still pressed close around the window panes. Afterward, they sat near the fire, sharing a tin of preserved peaches she hadn't opened in over a year. She passed him the spoon, and he took it without a word, dipping into the syrup like it was something sacred. "My mother used to put up peaches in stone jars," he said. "Lost the recipe when we moved west. Never tasted them since." She leaned against the arm of the chair. "They're sweeter when there's someone to share them with." He looked at her, the firelight soft along his jaw. "I want to build something here, not just pass through." "You already have," she said. The next morning, she found him outside early, stacking stones into a waist-high wall near the edge of the yard. When she asked, he told her it would help keep the wind from scouring the henhouse once the snow melted and the spring gusts began. You could have waited to start that, she said, brushing snow from her shawl. I'm tired of waiting, he replied, fitting another stone into place without looking up. She stood beside him, watching the wall take shape. You ever think about building something for yourself? I think about it more now than I ever did. She reached down, picked up a flat rock, and handed it to him. Their fingers touched brief, sure. That evening, he brought in a small chest from his wagon. Inside were a few shirts, a worn book of cattle records, a leather pouch with his initials carved faint into the side. He set it near the hearth without speaking. I never said you couldn't bring your things, Olivia said gently. You didn't have to. She smiled, a slow thing that reached her eyes. I'll clear the second peg. He nodded, a flicker of gratitude passing over his face. I'd like that. As night settled in and the wind rose again beyond the logs, Olivia poured hot water into the basin and dipped a cloth to wash her hands. Orin came up behind her, slow and quiet, and rested a palm against her back. You're not just the reason I stayed, he said, voice low beside her ear. You're the reason I want to stay. She turned then, not with surprise, but with something held deep and certain. Then stay, she said. And in the spring, we'll plant something worth keeping. He kissed her once, careful and full of promise. And outside, the snow kept falling, but inside, the warmth held. By mid-January, the snow fell less often, and when it did, it came quiet and fine, more like dust than weight. The days lengthened by minutes, just enough to notice. And though the wind still cut sharp, the light had changed, less brittle, more forgiving. Orin stood in the doorway of the cabin, holding a length of softened cowhide he'd spent the morning shaping into a sling for the kindling satchel. Olivia was bent near the hearth, coaxing heat into the last of the bread dough, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. She had taken to humming under her breath when she worked, not songs he recognized, but ones that suited her low and even, like river water moving beneath ice. You always this precise with your stitching? She asked as he joined her at the table, laying the leather flat. I had a horse once that wouldn't carry a pack unless the straps were even on both sides. Spent a summer learning the hard way. She pressed her thumb into the dough, testing its spring. That horse still around? No. He broke a leg crossing the Tongue River. I put him down myself. Her hands stilled. That's a hard thing. It was, he said. But he trusted me to do it. She looked at him then, and something passed between them, not sorrow, not quite, but a kind of mutual knowing, the kind that comes only after enough shared silence. That evening, Orin returned from the treeline dragging a small cedar sapling, its roots still clinging to the earth. Olivia met him at the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Cedar? She asked. Was growing crooked near the fence. Wouldn't have made it upright. He set it near the shed, digging a ring with his boot heel. Thought we might plant it come thaw. Something to mark this winter by. She moved beside him, brushing snow from the roots. I'd like that. In the days that followed, they began clearing the back slope, working side by side. Olivia had never held an adze before, but Orin showed her how to angle her arms to keep from straining her shoulder. She caught on fast. They worked until their gloves were stiff with frost, and then they warmed their hands around the stove, sharing stewed beans and slices of dried apple dipped in syrup. One afternoon, she found him inside with a piece of scrapwood and the carving blade he kept wrapped in oiled cloth. He'd whittled the cedar into a small box with dovetail joints and a smooth sliding lid. Inside, he placed a folded scrap of paper, creased from being opened and shut too many times. She ran a finger across the edge. You made this. I did. It's yours. He didn't offer what was inside the paper, and she didn't ask. She placed the box on the mantel beside the pine cone she'd kept from her first season in the valley. That night, she brought out the quilt she'd been piecing together since October, dark blue calico, trimmed with old shirt cuffs and strips of muslin. She laid it across the bed without ceremony. I thought we might use this one, she said. He stood beside her, quiet. You sure? He asked. She nodded. I've been sure. Just needed time to feel it. He touched her hand then, not just in reassurance, but with reverence. Then let's call this ours. The next morning, they hitched the wagon and drove into town for supplies. Olivia hadn't been since the first snowfall. Her boots crunched over the packed snow of the main road, her hand resting against Orin's arm as they walked toward the mercantile. Inside, Mrs. Lyle blinked at them once, then offered a slow, startled smile. "Didn't expect to see you two before spring." Orin tipped his hat. "Thought we'd restock the flour bin." They picked out a bolt of gingham, a spool of wax thread, and a jar of molasses. Orin added a tin of coffee and a new axe handle. Olivia chose a single length of green ribbon. When they reached the counter, Mr. Lyle squinted at them over his spectacles. "You two look well," he said. "We are," Olivia replied. "Better than we've been." Outside, the wind carried the scent of chimney smoke and pine. As Orin loaded the wagon, Olivia leaned against the wheel. "Would it bother you to marry here in the valley?" she asked. His hands stilled over the grain sack. "Not even a little." She nodded once. "Then that's what we'll do." They were married 2 weeks later, just after the first thaw. No preacher, just a blessing from Mrs. Lyle and 2 neighbors to sign the paper. Olivia wore the ribbon at her collar. Orin wore his best shirt, pressed flat under a stack of books the night before. They stood in the clearing behind the cabin, the cedar sapling planted in softening ground nearby. Afterward, they sat on the porch, warm mugs in their hands, the sun dipping behind the ridge. A pair of geese traced the sky overhead, their calls long and low. "I've never had a place feel like it was mine before," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You do now." The days grew longer. They planted potatoes and squash, mended the roof, and built a second chicken coop. Orin carved a new yoke for the wagon. Olivia stitched curtains for the windows. And when the creek thawed, they fished side by side, their boots sunk in mud, laughter tucked between the trees. The cabin filled with the sounds of life again, not loud, not sudden, but steady. A chair scraped gently across the floor. A kettle whistled. A voice hummed something low and content. When the first wildflowers bloomed along the south slope, Olivia pressed one between the pages of the ledger she now kept in the cupboard. Above the mantel, the cedar box remained, unopened and unspoken of, but never hidden. They grew together like things that had always belonged to the same soil. Not without history, but with roots now shared. And when the snow came again the following winter, it found them side by side in the same bed, the fire warm, the kettle full, and nothing missing. Not anymore.